The sun hung low over Maplewood Park, casting long, golden shadows across the neatly trimmed lawns. It was one of those rare afternoons that felt untouched by worries, the kind of day where time seemed to slow just enough for people to breathe a little easier. Children raced each other down the pathways, their laughter ringing through the cool autumn air. Young couples lounged on picnic blankets, and the scent of fresh coffee from a nearby food cart drifted lazily across the park. Sarah, a local schoolteacher, walked leisurely along the main path, holding Max's leash in one hand and a warm cup of tea in the other. Max, her 5-year-old golden Labrador, trotted happily beside her, his nose twitching with every new scent the breeze carried his way. To anyone watching, they looked like the perfect picture of calm, a woman and her dog simply enjoying a perfect day. Max was a favorite among the regulars of the park. Children loved to run up and give him quick pats on the head, and older folks often slipped him treats from their pockets when Sarah wasn't looking. He was known for his gentle nature, his patience, and above all, his endless enthusiasm for life. Never once had he growled at a stranger or pulled too hard on his leash. That was just not Max's way. Sarah found an empty bench under a sprawling oak tree and sat down, sipping her tea and watching the world go by. Max sniffed around the grass nearby, occasionally looking back at her with his goofy, loving grin. She pulled out a paperback novel from her bag, but found herself more entertained by the life happening around her than by the words on the page. For a long moment, it felt like nothing could disturb the peace. The chatter of families, the bark of distant dogs, the rustle of leaves overhead, it all blended into a soothing melody of ordinary life. Sarah smiled to herself, grateful for the small, quiet beauty of it. But then Max froze. It was so sudden that Sarah immediately set her cup down and watched him closely. His body had gone rigid, his ears perked high, his nose working furiously in the air. He stared at something, or someone, across the park with such focus that Sarah's stomach gave a small, involuntary flip. She followed Max's line of sight and spotted a man walking quickly along the path, a worn backpack slung over one shoulder. There was nothing immediately alarming about him, yet something about Max's reaction was different. Different enough that Sarah's heart began to pound harder in her chest. Something was coming. She could feel it. And it all started with Max's nose. As the days turned into weeks, Max's behavior became even more peculiar. The quiet, observant German shepherd had long since abandoned his usual, playful self. His eyes, once full of life and curiosity, were now fixed almost permanently on the storm drain. It wasn't just a passing fancy. There was something deeper in his gaze, a look of determination, as though he were waiting for something to happen. It wasn't just the Reynolds family who noticed. The entire neighborhood began to talk. Every morning, Max would sit by the drain, not moving an inch. His tail, which used to wag enthusiastically at the sight of his family or anyone else who greeted him, now hung limply at his side. He barely seemed to acknowledge the world around him, as though he had entered a trance-like state. Neighbors began to mention it casually to one another. "Have you seen Max lately?" Mrs. Thompson asked, her voice tinged with concern. "He's been sitting there by that drain every morning. It's almost like he's guarding it or waiting for something." Her words echoed through the neighborhood. Other residents, who had also noticed Max's odd routine, couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Yet no one really knew what to make of it. Some people figured he was just a dog with a weird habit. Others wondered if there was something inside the drain that was keeping his attention so firmly. It wasn't uncommon for dogs to get fixated on certain smells, after all. But with each passing day, the mystery deepened. Max's staring became more intense. He would sometimes whine softly, his body tense as though on high alert, as if he could sense something that no one else could. It was almost as though he were on guard, waiting for something to emerge. The air around the drain seemed charged, and the soft, almost unnoticeable hum of the neighborhood became drowned out by Max's eerie silence. The whispers turned into discussions. Some of the younger residents began to speculate about strange occurrences in the neighborhood. Had the man moved quickly but without running, blending in just enough to avoid drawing attention. at least from the people who weren't paying close. He wore a weathered gray coat that looked a size too big, with sleeves that swallowed his hands. His jeans were scuffed and his sneakers were splattered with dried mud. A dark green backpack, stuffed full and awkwardly bulging at the seams, hung heavily from one shoulder. Max's reaction grew more intense with every step the man took. The dog let out a low, rumbling growl, something so rare for him that Sarah immediately stood up from the bench, her book slipping to the ground unnoticed. Her fingers tightened around Max's leash, feeling the sudden strength in his body as he strained forward. Sarah frowned, watching the man more carefully now. He didn't look up. His gaze stayed locked on the path ahead, his head ducked slightly, almost as if he was trying to make himself invisible. But there was something about the way he clutched his backpack, his knuckles pale against the dark straps, that set every one of Sarah's nerves on edge. Max barked once, sharply, snapping the attention of a few nearby joggers. Some glanced at the man, then at Sarah, their expressions curious but unconcerned. To them, it probably looked like Max was just an overexcited dog seeing a new person, but Sarah knew better. She had lived with Max long enough to understand that this wasn't excitement, it was warning. The man veered off the path slightly, moving toward a quieter area near the cluster of picnic tables. Max's whole body trembled with urgency, and Sarah had to dig her heels into the ground to keep him from lunging outright. Her heart pounded, each beat louder than the last, as 1,000 questions swirled in her mind. Should she call someone? Was she overreacting? Maybe it was nothing. Maybe Max was just sensing something she couldn't see, like leftover food in the backpack or the scent of another animal. But then, almost as if he could feel her doubt, Max let out another bark, louder, sharper, and Sarah's hesitation vanished. She trusted Max. Always had. Whatever was going on, it wasn't normal. The man glanced over his shoulder then for just a brief moment. His eyes were dark and darted nervously from person to person. When they landed on Max, he froze mid-step. It was only for a heartbeat, but Sarah caught it. She saw the fear flash across his face. He knew Max had caught on, and that was when Sarah realized this was no ordinary walk in the park. Something much bigger was about to unfold, and somehow, Max was the only one who had sensed it first. Noticed that the storm drain had started to smell a bit different lately. Mrs. Larson, who lived 2 houses down from the Reynolds family, mentioned that she thought she'd heard faint sounds coming from the drain late one night, soft and far away, but unmistakable. Maybe it's just some animal in there, she said. It wouldn't be the first time something got stuck in one of those drains. But the speculation didn't ease anyone's unease. There was something unsettling about how Max had become so fixated. Dogs don't act like that unless something is truly wrong. Max wasn't just staring at the drain. He was waiting for something. And as the days passed, it was becoming clear to the neighborhood that something was about to happen. But what? Max's behavior wasn't just strange. It was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. Every day, more and more people began to notice the dog's strange routine. The murmurs and curiosity had reached a boiling point. The neighborhood was no longer simply wondering why Max stared into the drain. They were beginning to wonder what exactly he was waiting for. Before Sarah could react, Max lunged with surprising force, nearly yanking the leash out of her hand. His bark, usually playful and full of joy, turned into a deep, urgent sound that echoed through the park. Heads turned. A few parents scooped up their children instinctively. Conversations hushed. Even the birds seemed to pause in the trees above. Sarah struggled to hold Max back. His muscles were taut like a drawn bow, his entire body straining toward the man with the backpack. It was clear now. This wasn't a playful chase. Max was trying to get to them, and nothing about it felt ordinary. Max, calm down, Sarah said in a loud whisper, glancing around at the growing number of curious onlookers. She tugged firmly on the leash, but Max dug his paws into the ground, refusing to back away. His nose pointed straight at the backpack, nostrils flaring, as if the scent he had picked up was too strong to ignore. The man noticed. His steps quickened. His eyes darted nervously again, scanning for an exit, for a way out of the growing attention. The heavy backpack bounced awkwardly against his side as he walked faster, almost breaking into a run. Max barked again, this time sharp enough to make even Sarah flinch. A ripple of unease spread through the nearby crowd. A few teenagers pulled out their phones, sensing that something unusual was happening. An elderly man, walking his poodle, whispered something to his wife and steered her away from the path. Sarah's instincts screamed at her to act, but she hesitated, torn between staying out of trouble and trusting her dog. Max had never reacted like this before, not even when a neighbor's cat teased him or a stray squirrel bolted across his path. This was different. It was something deeper and more primal. The man started to veer off the main path toward a less crowded area near the wooded edge of the park. Max practically stood on his hind legs, whining now between barks, desperate to get closer. It was as if he were trying to tell everyone, Look at him. Something's wrong." "Is everything okay?" A woman nearby asked Sarah cautiously, stepping closer with a stroller in front of her. Sarah could only shake her head, her mouth dry, heart hammering. "I don't know," she managed to say, her voice thin. "But I think my dog does." Somewhere deep inside, Sarah understood that this moment mattered. She couldn't ignore it. Max wasn't just reacting. He was warning her, warning all of them. And whatever was inside that man's backpack, it was something that had to be found. Sarah tightened her grip on Max's leash, feeling his urgency like a current running up her arm. Her mind raced with possibilities, none of them comforting. She knew she had to do something, but what could she really do? She wasn't a police officer. She wasn't trained for situations like this. Yet when she looked down at Max, there was no hesitation in his eyes, only certainty. That was enough. Gathering her courage, Sarah started moving, not running, but walking fast enough to follow the man without drawing too much attention. Max moved with her, his body tense, every step brimming with barely controlled energy. She could feel other parkgoers watching her, whispering among themselves, but she didn't care. All that mattered was keeping the man in sight. The man glanced over his shoulder again and noticed Sarah following him. His face twisted in frustration, and for a split second, he looked like he might bolt. Instead, he pressed the backpack closer to his chest and quickened his pace toward the wooded area beyond the picnic tables, where fewer people ventured. Sarah's heart thudded painfully in her chest. Her mind screamed at her to stop, to let someone else handle it, but her feet kept moving forward. Max was pulling now, not aggressively, but insistently, leading her like a compass toward the man. Then, as if the tension reached a breaking point, the man suddenly broke into a sprint, disappearing into the trees. Without thinking, Sarah dropped her cup and ran after him, Max surging ahead on the leash. Branches whipped at her arms, and the uneven ground made her stumble, but she didn't stop. "Hey, stop!" she shouted, her voice cracking. For a few terrifying seconds, Sarah thought she had lost him. The trees blurred together, the air colder and heavier under the thick canopy. But then she spotted a flash of gray coat through the trees. Max barked furiously, pulling harder, urging her onward. Somewhere deep in the woods, the man tripped, crashing to the ground with a loud thud. Sarah slowed just enough to see him struggling to get up, the backpack slipping from his shoulder. Max lunged forward, barking and growling, standing between Sarah and the man as if daring him to move. The man froze, his eyes wide with panic. Sarah's hands shook as she pulled out her phone and dialed 911, her voice trembling as she explained the situation. She had no idea what she was about to find, but one thing was clear: there was no turning back now. Whatever was inside that backpack had drawn Max into action, and Sarah had trusted him every step of the way. Now they were about to find out why. Sarah stood a few feet away, trying to catch her breath, while Max stayed firmly between her and the man. His growls had softened to low, warning rumbles, but he never looked away from the backpack that now lay half open on the ground. The man didn't make a move to pick it up. He stayed sitting where he had fallen, hands lifted slightly as if to show he meant no harm. Sarah kept her phone pressed to her ear, her voice low and urgent as she spoke to the dispatcher. She described the location as best as she could, giving landmarks and details while never taking her eyes off the backpack. Max's instincts had brought them this far. There was no way she was going to ignore him now. The man said nothing, just sat there, breathing heavily, watching Sarah with a strange mixture of fear and sadness. She expected him to run again, to try to fight back, but he seemed to have given up completely. Minutes felt like hours. Finally, distant sirens began to wail, growing louder as they neared the park. Sarah took a cautious step forward, curiosity battling fear inside her. The backpack had tipped onto its side, and something shiny caught the light from the gaps in the trees. Max whimpered softly, looking back at her as if asking for permission. Hard hammering, Sarah inched closer. She bent down slowly, her hands trembling, and carefully opened the top of the backpack the rest of the way. She gasped. Inside, instead of weapons or anything dangerous, there were small, crumpled blankets, a handful of half-empty water bottles, and dozens of tiny, pitiful eyes blinking up at her. Kittens, at least 10 of them, huddled together inside, their small bodies pressed close for warmth and comfort. They mewed weakly, clearly frightened but unharmed. Sarah stared in disbelief. It took her a full moment to process what she was seeing. Max stopped growling, his tail wagging tentatively as he sniffed the air around the kittens. The man lowered his gaze to the ground, speaking for the first time, his voice hoarse. I couldn't leave them, he said. They were abandoned behind a building. I didn't know what else to do. Tears pricked at Sarah's eyes. All the fear, all the tension, and all the chaos had led to this. A desperate man trying to save helpless lives in the only way he knew how. The sirens were closer now. Soon, authorities would arrive and explanations would have to be made. But for a moment, Sarah knelt there, her hand resting gently on Max's head, marveling at the strange and beautiful turn this day had taken. Within minutes, 2 police officers arrived, their presence sending a ripple through the quiet woods. One officer approached cautiously while the other stayed back, speaking into a radio. Sarah stood up slowly, stepping away from the backpack, but keeping herself between Max and the man, just in case. It's okay, Sarah said quickly, raising a hand. He's not dangerous. You need to see what's in the bag. The officers exchanged a look but moved in carefully. When one of them knelt down and peered into the backpack, his hardened expression softened instantly. Kittens, he said, glancing back at his partner. Sarah nodded, explaining everything as calmly as she could. The chase, Max's unusual behavior, and how they ended up here. The man sat silently, shoulders slumped, as though he was ready for whatever consequences would come next. After a moment, one of the officers turned to the man and spoke in a gentler voice than Sarah expected. Sir, we need to understand what's going on. Can you tell us your name? The man hesitated, then answered quietly, Daniel. Daniel Cole. Okay, Daniel. Why were you running? The officer asked. Daniel ran a hand through his messy hair, looking utterly defeated. I found them behind a dumpster near my building. No food, no shelter. I couldn't leave them. I don't have a home myself. I was trying to get them somewhere safe. His words hung in the air, heavier than any accusation. Sarah's heart ached at the confession. Daniel wasn't a threat. He was just another person struggling, trying to do something right in a world that often looked away. The officers exchanged another look, and the one who had been speaking nodded. You're not under arrest, Daniel. We just need to make sure the kittens are cared for properly, and that you're okay too. Relief flooded Daniel's face. It wasn't dramatic, just a subtle sag of his shoulders and a deep breath that seemed to lighten him somehow. An animal rescue volunteer, called in by the officers, arrived shortly after with a crate and supplies. She carefully transferred the kittens, checking each one with gentle hands. Max watched the entire process, sitting patiently by Sarah's side as if supervising the rescue. As the kittens were carried off safely, Sarah turned to Daniel. There was so much she wanted to say, but in the end, she just smiled and said, You did a good thing. Daniel gave a small, grateful nod. In the midst of the chaos, fear, and misunderstanding, kindness had managed to shine through. And it all started with a dog who refused to ignore a scent no one else could detect. As the animal rescue worker carefully loaded the kittens into her van, Sarah lingered by the police car where Daniel sat quietly on the open back seat, not handcuffed, just waiting. Max rested beside her, his tongue lolling out happily now that the tension had faded. One of the officers, a woman named Officer Reyes, approached Sarah with a thoughtful expression. "You really helped today," she said. "Without you and your dog, those kittens might not have made it." Sarah glanced down at Max and scratched behind his ears. "He's the real hero," she said warmly. Reyes smiled, then lowered her voice. "We're contacting some shelters about Daniel. It's clear he didn't mean any harm. He just needs a little help too." Sarah felt a wave of relief. It would have been easy for the world to be harsh with someone like Daniel. Easy to judge without understanding. But today, maybe things would be different. As the officers wrapped up their reports and the park slowly returned to normal, Sarah found herself sitting beside Daniel on a bench. For a moment, they just watched the fading sunlight paint the sky in soft oranges and purples. "I didn't want to scare anyone," Daniel said after a long silence. His voice was rough but sincere. "I just didn't know where else to go." "I believe you," Sarah replied simply. Max sat at their feet, his nose occasionally twitching as if still keeping guard. Sarah watched Daniel glance down at the dog, his face softening. "You've got a good one there," Daniel said. Sarah chuckled. "Yeah, he's stubborn though. Won't stop until he's sure everything's right." Daniel smiled faintly, a shadow of a man who had once been much lighter. "Wish I had that kind of instinct." For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of leaves rustling in the gentle breeze. It was peaceful, a stark contrast to the frantic energy from just an hour ago. And somehow, sitting there, Sarah realized that sometimes life gives people a second chance in the most unexpected ways. Officer Reyes returned with some paperwork and a soft offer. A temporary shelter had agreed to help Daniel find stable housing, and the animal rescue had promised to keep him updated on the kitten's health. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was a real, hopeful beginning. Daniel looked stunned, as if he had forgotten what it felt like to have someone offer help instead of suspicion. Sarah stood, offering him her hand. "Come on, let's make sure you and those kittens get the fresh start you deserve." And with Max trotting proudly beside them, they headed toward a new beginning none of them had seen coming. Weeks later, the park looked almost exactly the same. The trees still whispered in the breeze, kids still raced along the winding paths, and families laid out picnic blankets under the wide, open sky. But for Sarah, everything felt a little different now. Lighter, more hopeful. She sat at her usual bench, sipping a coffee and tossing the occasional treat to Max, who lounged at her feet. His nose twitched as he watched a group of children chase after a soccer ball, but for once he seemed completely relaxed. Maybe because he knew that, somewhere nearby, the people he had helped were thriving. A familiar voice called out across the lawn, "Sarah." She turned and smiled as Daniel approached, carrying a small homemade carrier crafted from an old backpack, the same one that had caused so much panic that day. Inside, two of the kittens peered out, their tiny faces filled with curiosity and trust. "They let me keep them," Daniel said proudly. "After I got into the shelter program, they said I could take care of a couple as emotional support animals. Meet Clover and Scout." Sarah crouched down to admire the little kittens, feeling a warm surge of pride for how far Daniel had come. He looked healthier now, his clothes clean and his hair trimmed. There was a spark in his eyes, something that had been missing the day they first met. Max wagged his tail excitedly and sniffed the carrier, giving a happy bark as if approving Daniel's new companions. "They're perfect," Sarah said, straightening up. Daniel grinned. "I think we're all a little better off because of one stubborn dog who wouldn't take no for an answer." Sarah laughed, remembering how scared and uncertain she had been that day. How a single strange moment had unraveled into a story she would never forget. They spent the afternoon talking, sharing stories and dreams they hadn't dared voice before. Other park-goers wandered by, drawn to the adorable kittens and the friendly dog, and for a while it felt like the entire world had slowed down just enough for them to catch their breath. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in gold and crimson, Sarah realized that second chances weren't just for Daniel or the kittens. In a strange way, that day had given her one too, a reminder that kindness, trust, and a little bit of bravery could change everything. And as Max rested his head on her knee, Sarah knew that sometimes the best adventures begin with a simple scent on the wind and the courage to follow it.